Hello, and welcome to the Santee Church of Christ Bible Study Rewind, where we review last week's lessons that we learned from reading from God's Word. Currently, we are under COVID restrictions, so we're not having class on site. So we're doing it basically over Google Meet service. And it's been going really well, regardless of not being able to be in the same room with everybody. We are in the book of Deuteronomy, and we are studying the last part of chapter 12 and the first part of chapter 13. So just by way of reminder, Deuteronomy is a reminder of the law and the statutes that God is giving to Israel after some 40 years after they come out of Egypt as slaves, and they're moving into the promised land, if you will, Canaan. And God has essentially built a great army of all the citizens. It includes everybody, not only the fighting men, but all the people who support them, the families. So God is dispensating to them not only the Ten Commandments, but all of these other contingency laws that they are to obey in order to be a good representative of Him. So that's why it's important to study this, because we get an insight as to, what God is expecting from His people back then and how it might translate into the newer covenant that we enjoy and are blessed with through Jesus Christ. So we are starting at verses 15 through 28 of chapter 12, and then 29 through 32 of chapter 13. Of chapter 12 as well. And then verses 1 through 5 of chapter 13. Sorry about that. So I'm going to go ahead and read the entire text. I'll go over the answers that I had. And then I have everyone else's responses written down, and I'll go through those as well, just so we can get an idea of what everybody was seeing in the text. So Deuteronomy 12, verses 15 through 28, and then 29 through 32, and then chapter 13, verses 1 through 5. I'm just going to read the whole thing so we can get it all in one read. So God has already just said in verse 13, "Take heed that you don't offer offerings in every place that you see." Now, let's remember chapter 12 is a major division of the book. It is basically God dispensating directives. Not a lot of history in this section. It's mostly about what they are to do. He tells them not to burn offerings in strange places and that sort of thing. He's telling them where they are to worship Him. And last week, he basically goes over the idea for them to clean out all the idols and then establish these places where everyone will worship God together. "Only with all the desire of your soul you shall sacrifice and shall eat flesh within all your gates, according to the blessing of Jehovah your God, which He has given you. The unclean and the clean, one may eat of it, as of the gazelle and as of the hart," which is, like a wild animal. So he's going to go over places they can eat their common meals, within their own towns and cities and homes, and then he's going to go over specifically where to conduct sacrifices. "Only you shall not eat the blood; you shall pour it out as water on the earth. You are not able to eat the tithe of your grain within your gates," in other words, within your city. "And your new wine and your oil and the firstlings of your herd and of your flock and of your vows which you vow." and your free will offering and the heave offering of your hand, but you shall eat it before Jehovah your God. In other words, the place that God is going to establish, which he chooses. You and your son and your daughter and your male slave, your female slave, the Levite who is within your gates, and you shall rejoice before Jehovah and your God in all that you do and put your hand to. Take heed to yourself that you do not forsake the Levite as long as you live on the land. Then Jehovah your God shall enlarge your border as he has promised you, and shall say, I will eat flesh. And you will say, I will eat flesh, because your soul desires to eat flesh. You may eat flesh according to all the desire of your soul. If the place which Jehovah your God shall choose to put his name there is too far from you, in other words, these places where they are to sacrifice, then you shall kill of your herd of your flock, which Jehovah has given you, as I commanded you, and you shall eat within your gates, according to all the desire of your soul. Now, God will give more directives on these later. Only as the gazelle and the hart are eaten, so you shall eat of it. The unclean and the clean you may eat of it. So he's differentiating. Only be sure not to eat the blood, for the blood is the life. You shall not eat the life with the flesh. You shall not eat it. You shall pour it on the earth as water. You shall not eat it in order that it may be well with you and with your sons and after you, when you do that which is right in the eyes of Jehovah. Only your holy things which you have, and your vows which you shall take up, and which you shall go to the place which Jehovah shall choose. And you shall offer your burnt offerings, the flesh and the blood, on the altar of Jehovah your God, and the blood of your sacrifices shall be poured out by the altar of Jehovah your God, and you shall eat the flesh. So there's that differentiation. He's talking about official sacrifices here. Take heed to listen to all these words which I am commanding you, in order that it may be well with you and with your sons after you forever. When you do that which is good and right in the eyes of Jehovah your God. When Jehovah your God shall cut off the nations from before you, where you are going to possess them, and you shall possess them, you shall live in their land. Take heed to yourself that you do not be snared to follow after them, after they have been destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire after their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? And shall I do so, even I? You shall not do so to Jehovah your God. For everything hateful to Jehovah, which he detests, they have been done to their gods. For they have even burned their sons and their daughters in the fire to their gods. And one of the students went into great detail as to how terrible this practice was. Actually burning their children alive is terrible. All the things that I command you, take heed to do them, and you shall not add to it or take away from it. And that was another note that a lot of us were listening to and taking heed to, that God says, look, if I say something, this is what you do. Don't add to it. Don't change it. If a prophet, now he's getting into chapter 13. He's going to talk about people wanting to lead the people away from him. If a prophet or a dreamer of dreams rises among you, and he gives you a sign or a wonder, and this is most likely a prophecy or something that he says, a vision that he says he's seen. In some cases, some people may think it's a miracle or something. Not likely, but whatever it is, it's trickery, and we'll get into that. And the sign or the wonder which he spoke to you occurs, saying, let us go after other gods, which you have not known, and let us serve them. You shall not listen to the words of that prophet. In other words, if whatever he says happens, and then he says, let's go serve those other gods, that's what we need to do next, don't do it. For Jehovah your God is testing you, to know if you love Jehovah your God with all your heart and with all your soul. You shall walk after Jehovah your God, and you shall fear him, and you shall keep his commandments, and you shall hear his voice, and you shall serve him, and you shall cleave to him. And that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall die. And I don't think that means that God's going to kill him. I think that means he or she needs to be executed. Because he has spoken apostasy against Jehovah your God, who is bringing you out of the land of Egypt, and has redeemed you out of the house of slaves, to thrust you out of the way in which Jehovah your God has commanded you to walk. And you shall put away from you, and you shall put evil from among you. Okay, so that's where we ended up with all the responses and answers. So the first question came out, what were the rules to govern the people's worship, and what were we to learn with it from this? And that was what I was saying originally, that God is establishing a place that where he is expecting specific sacrifices. In other words, you might do some sort of eating or maybe some sacrifices at home within your own cities, within your own gates, they call. But there will be times when God requires, like the first fruits in your tithing and then that sort of thing, and any sort of vow. Don't do that at home. You go to where God is represented, and that is where you do that. That's where those specific sacrifices were to happen. And also, they may eat blood, they may eat meat, but not blood. And this points to something even more important, I think. The Levites were to be supported, and that points to something. The Levites did not receive land within Canaan. They did have the cities of refuge, but their job was to minister between the population and God. That was their job, and God said, you take care of them. Don't let them go hungry. Don't let them be poor and destitute. Feel free to eat whatever meat you desire. For sacrifices, if you live too far from the designated place of worship, you may eat within the gates of your city. Don't eat blood, pour it on the ground. He says it again. So we're going to see later those practices where if you couldn't make it to Jerusalem, say, there were contingencies for that person who either couldn't make the journey or they were too poor, that sort of thing. For specific offerings and vows, only do these at the place specified by God. These instructions indicate that offering sacrifices was to be constant in their lives. Even in daily activity, eating was to be in the context as something received by God. Other people said it was not to be common in some instances. It was to become sacred. And God is very specific when it comes to worship. And how could people fall into the point of sacrificing children? That is covered in the next section. The warning in 29 through 32, that's the God telling them, don't think about even doing any sort of idolatry, because these people are terrible. They're burning their children alive. Don't even think about it. And the warning against is the desire to learn about the defeated nations' gods with the intent to serve them. The warning includes reasoning of the horrible practice of child sacrifice. So what is interesting here is that the people can fall into such dire practices, and how does that happen? And my main thinking is it's always incremental. You do a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and a little bit more. You start accepting things that God doesn't accept, and before you know it, you're in the middle of something terrible like that. And we had several people comment on that. So in chapter 13, the question is, what were the people to do with a false prophet? And how would the people know if the prophet was false? What do we learn from this? Well, in this instance, the prophet is advising the people to go after other gods. And Jehovah is making it clear that anyone who tries this needs to be executed. The interesting part is that this person has the ability to perform something, either some sort of prophecy or maybe some sort of miracle. I don't think it was heavy on the miracle part, but that doesn't mean that those kind of things didn't exist. This is why God was always going against people who would divine other powers than him, people who had divination powers. He said, don't go after them. You just come to me. And he has a way of doing that. And we see that all through Numbers and that sort of thing with them, with the people often asking God, should we do this? Should we do that? That's what he's looking for. Don't be fooled by what you see, but what they ask is the point here. It's the main message. It is also interesting that Moses says, Jehovah your God is testing you. This is a seemingly direct contradiction to James's clarification that God does not test us or tempt us. So how do we reconcile these two statements? Well, God will allow, and this was my answer, God will allow temptations to come upon us, right? And as James explains, it's always of our own doing. And this is simply a revelation to God. It's an expression of what's in our heart, the things that we do. We might say we have faith, but if we're performing all kinds of terrible sins against God, against people, then our faith is useless. It's not faith. Because the proof of our faith, regardless of what anybody tells you, the proof of our faith is by what we do. Revelation tells us this is how we will be judged, is by our deeds. I'm not saying that. That's what the scriptures say. Okay, so that covers everything that we went over. I just wanted to make these additional comments that the other people in the class made. Some of this was a communal meal when God was dispensing where you can eat, what you can eat, and at what time, and and the sacrifices were to be separate. But some of this was a communal meal, and sometimes in the gates and the cities and the towns and homes and that sort of thing. Some of it was to be dedicated to God. Other times were more common meals. So you have this separation of the common meal, although it's still done with thankfulness to God, with God in mind. And then you have these sacred things that were separate just toward God, but it was still communal a lot of times, like tithes and other sacrifices. And sometimes they intersect, and this was the purpose for that. Even when you're at home, it's not like you eat without regard to thinking about God or thanking God. You still thank God. It's always with God in mind that we partake of his blessings. And that is, I think that's the overriding message. And when you get to the Christian dispensation, that is really revealed even more, that everything is within our whole living is within the context of Jehovah. Some people found it interesting, this exclusion of eating blood and the life that's in it, and that it kind of points to the importance of blood when you get to the Christ, when Jesus comes. The importance of the life being in the blood is revealed even more so. That's kind of this abstract thought, but I just threw that out there because I thought it was important to see the foreshadowing here. So through 29 through 32, the statements were: start having relationships. Oh, avoid having relationships where we're unequally yoked, and that's a New Testament term. In other words, they go in, they wipe everybody out, but they want to have this relationship with this God, and that God will turn them away from Jehovah, and that, you can't do that. You can't open that door, because it just leads you into destruction before God. These people were being influenced by them instead of them being, if they went into the land and this was something that somebody brought up, they actually go into the land and then they become influenced by the people. They are unequally yoked. Instead of the people being influenced by Israel, Israel was influenced by them. That's a warning even in the New Testament, even in our covenant with God today. The world will promise you things that are missing in your life. And this is how they become depraved, a little bit at a time. And I think that's an excellent point. And this happens in the religious world as well. We see the religious world going off the rails today, saying that things are okay, that when you look in the scriptures, you're going, God doesn't say it's okay. We can't change God's teaching. It's not for us to change. And this is something we see around the world today. Somebody said, we see today's parents allowing their children to practice things he does not approve of. Even young children being told they can do certain things. And they're children. They need leadership. They don't need power. They need leadership. And I think that's a failure on every parent to a certain degree, where sometimes we miss the mark as parents. But today we just see parents going off the rails completely and letting their children take the reins when they're not ready yet. And that's a broad statement, and I think that's a blanket statement. Not every situation is the same. Everything needs to be taken with nuance. So in chapter 13, the sign is a prophecy with trickery in mind. So that was a statement of one of the people that study with us, that when these prophets come and they can just spew all kinds of prophecies, and then one of them comes true and they say, see, I was right, I'm a prophet. And then later we see that if a prophet says something and it doesn't come true, that's how we know they're not a prophet. But if one of their prophecies comes true, we know that it's a trick. If they're saying we need to leave God, God is saying, if anybody just says leave God for leave me for another God, they're not a prophet. It's a deceitful action. The hearer needs to be aware. If idolatry is part of it, it's wrong. And today, I keep saying this, but today it's true. Idolatry can take all sorts of forms, even just simple covetousness or greed or whatever. Somebody brought up 1 Thessalonians and Mark 16, and heresy will come with this type of heresy. We're obligated to have, we're obligated to have knowledge of what is acceptable to God. And we have to gain knowledge of God in order to understand these things before, before we can be found righteous in God. And there's a lot of caveat to that. We have to understand what He wants. And this is what the student was saying was we have to reach for those things. We have to come to a good understanding of what God has found acceptable and what He doesn't find acceptable. It's up to us to find those things out and defend them. God will not give us conflicting commands. And God will not say one thing and then all of a sudden change His mind later. This is a great thought. And the story that was brought up was when this young prophet was told, you go home and you don't stop anywhere. And then this other prophet stops him and says, well, God told me to tell you that you can come to my house. And then the young prophet goes to his house and sins. Obviously, the other prophet wasn't telling the truth. And the point there is, if God says, have no other gods before me, he will never change his mind about that. He's not saying, well, unless you want to, covet after something or have some sin in your life, that will be okay. He would never say that because he is not going to change. That's the justice we find in God. Most of the time, the message is subtle to walk away from God, and we need to be diligent to be able to recognize that and be diligent to not walk away from God. So there you have it. That was the lesson that we had last Sunday. We'll be doing this. We'll be getting into the latter part of chapter 13, and we'll start chapter 14 this coming Sunday, again with the Google Meet, service, because we're having a restricted sort of service outside for worship. We also have a really, really, really good 1 Peter study going on right now on Wednesdays at 7 o'clock via Zoom. So if you want to be part of any of that, if you want to know what it is that we aspire to through the scriptures or anything like that, you can go to our main website page, our Facebook page, or our YouTube page and just contact us. We'd love to study the Bible with you and let you know what God has in store for you in your life and what your purpose is in life. We all have different strengths and we all do different things well, but we all have a common purpose as Christians. Thank you. Thank you for listening. And Lord willing, we'll continue this next week. God bless you. And peace to you.